Before anything else, a warning. Viewer discretion is advised. What follows may be entertainment, but the emotional collision it depicts is very real. Because what happens when one of cinema's most disciplined, intense performers sits across from one of Hollywood's most controversial political voices? Sometimes a routine promotional interview transforms into the most devastating on-air dismantling daytime television has ever seen. What you're about to experience isn't just a celebrity disagreement. It is the moment Tom Cruise methodically tore apart Jane Fonda's carefully curated public image, exposing decades of unresolved contradictions in less than 20 minutes. A simple publicity stop became a full-scale confrontation, one that proved old wounds never truly close, and buried truths have a way of clawing their way to the surface. By the time it was over, one of Hollywood's most outspoken activists sat speechless, her defenses collapsing in front of millions who watched with stunned, breathless silence. The morning had begun with ordinary calm at The View's New York City studio. Production crews moved with their usual precision, adjusting lights, testing microphones, checking cues. Makeup artists dabbed at foundation while stage managers whispered timing notes into earpieces. The studio audience filtered in, buzzing with anticipation. Tom Cruise was coming. Tom Cruise, a name that carried history, intensity, and box office gravity. The producers had practically cheered when his team confirmed the appearance. Ratings gold, guaranteed. What they didn't know was that Jane Fonda had arrived in a distinctly combative mood. When Tom finally stepped onto the stage, the room erupted. He moved with that signature energy of his, controlled, coiled, almost electric. His smile flashed warmly as he waved, eyes alight with enthusiasm. In a perfectly tailored suit, he radiated movie star certainty. Whoopi Goldberg rose to greet him with genuine warmth, shaking his hand and guiding him to his seat. The host smiled, except Jane. She sat back, expression unreadable, lips bent into the faintest smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Those who knew her well might have recognized the look. It was the look of someone sharpening a blade. "Tom Cruise, welcome to The View," Whoopi said, delighted. "Thank you so much for having me," he replied, that unmistakable intensity coloring even his greeting. The interview began smoothly. Whoopi asked about the new film, its preparation, the demanding training, the physical risks he famously embraced. Tom brightened, leaning forward, fully alive in the discussion. "The thing about this character," he said, eyes blazing, "is that he stands for something. He doesn't back down from what's right, no matter the cost. That sense of commitment, that's what drew me in." The words were barely out before Jane seized her moment. She leaned forward, her voice edged with condescension. "Interesting, Tom," she said, slicing through Whoopi's next question. "I wonder about someone who talks so much about what's right while being part of an organization with a very questionable relationship to honesty and transparency." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop. The audience froze. Camera operators exchanged uneasy glances. Tom's promotional smile flickered, only for a second, before he regained his composure. But those who knew him recognized the shift. Things were about to get real. Whoopi tried to steer things back. "Let's talk about those action sequences." "No," she pressed, her voice swelling with moral certainty. "I think we need honesty. Here's someone who plays the all-American hero on screen, yet aligns with a group former members have called manipulative and dangerous. Doesn't the public deserve the truth, Tom?" Silence swallowed the room. And then Tom did something no one expected. He laughed. Not nervously, not defensively. A deep, genuine laugh that echoed across the tense studio. "Jane," he said at last, shaking his head with almost sympathetic disbelief, "this might be the most hypocritical thing I've heard in a very long time." Jane's confidence cracked. She'd expected anger, deflection, anything but laughter. "Excuse me?" she snapped, voice rising. Tom's charm peeled away, revealing something harder beneath, something sharp, dangerous, and utterly unshaken.
When Tom spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge, sharpening with every syllable. "You want to talk about questionable organizations and transparency?" he asked, leaning forward just slightly, the movement small but loaded with intention. "You want to talk about people who present themselves as one thing while being something entirely different behind the scenes?" He let the silence hold for a single devastating beat. "Jane," he said, delivering the blow with surgical precision, "you literally traveled to North Vietnam in the middle of a war. American soldiers were dying. You posed for propaganda photos with the enemy. You offered comfort to people who were holding American prisoners of war." His voice grew heavier, tinged with disbelief. "And now you want to sit here and lecture me about patriotism, about honesty, about transparency?" The studio erupted, not with applause, but with an involuntary, unsettled murmur. A couple of audience members gasped out loud. Jane Fonda's face went pale, then flushed crimson. She opened a mouth, closed it again, then tried once more as though grasping for a sentence that refused to form. "That was a different time," she finally stammered, her earlier certainty shattered. It was about trying to stop a senseless war that was killing people." "A different time," Tom repeated softly, but his intensity climbed like a rising flame. "Jane, those weren't headlines in a newspaper. Those were real lives, real families who lost sons, brothers, fathers, and there you were, offering comfort to the people shooting at them." He leaned back, but his eyes never left hers. "And you want to question my character?" Joy Behar made a desperate attempt to intervene. "Maybe we should all take a step back," she said weakly, looking for support that didn't come. But the interview had already veered off the rails. No one could stop it now. Feeling cornered, Jane did what the cornered often do. She attacked harder. "At least I had the courage to stand up for what I believed in," she snapped, her voice sharp but unsteady. "At least I wasn't hiding behind some cult-like organization that controls my life and tells me what to think." That was the breaking point. Tom's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The Hollywood charm, the polished promotional smile, gone. What replaced it was harder, colder, much more dangerous. The studio felt the shift like a sudden drop in air pressure. "Cult-like organization," Tom repeated quietly, almost whispering. Somehow the whisper was more menacing than any shouted retort could have been. The entire room leaned in, transfixed. "Let me tell you something about courage. Real courage. Not the Hollywood version, not the staged for publicity version. Actual courage." He let the silence hold for another unbearable instant. "Courage is not flying into enemy territory for a photo op that lands you on every front page. Courage is not grandstanding for cameras while real heroes die in rice paddies. Courage," he stabbed the words like needles, "is taking responsibility for your actions and living with the consequences, something you've never truly done." The audience froze. Even the camera operators seemed afraid to breathe. The space between them crackled with raw, unfiltered emotion. Jane tried to reclaim control, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who—" "No, Jane," Tom cut in clean and precise. "You are going to sit there and listen, because for once, someone is going to tell you the truth without worrying about your feelings, your reputation, or your carefully manufactured public persona." His intensity surged, impossible to look away from. "You want to talk about organizations? Fine. Let's talk about how you've spent decades lecturing others about morality and ethics while conveniently forgetting your own actions, the things you did that hurt real people." The words hit Jane like physical impacts. Her facade cracked visibly, the confidence draining out of her expression. She shrank in her chair, hands trembling. But Tom wasn't done. You think a few carefully crafted apologies erase what happened? You think reinventing yourself as an activist makes everyone forget you comforted people who tortured American soldiers? Whoopi tried again, futilely. Tom, maybe we can bring this back to your new film. He didn't even acknowledge her. The worst part, he said, eyes locked on Jane, is that you've never truly owned it. You've made excuses, rationalizations, rebranding, but you've never said, I was wrong, I hurt people, and I am truly sorry. Jane's hands trembled harder as she reached for her water glass. Her voice was a whisper. I have apologized. I've said many times that I regret. Regret? Tom cut in, his voice slicing through the air like a blade.
You regret? Tom repeated, the disbelief in his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. You talk about it like it was some minor social misstep, like you wore the wrong dress to an award show. He leaned in, intensity sharpening with every inch. Jane, do you have any idea, any concept at all, what it was like for the families of those prisoners to see you smiling and laughing with their captors? Do you understand the betrayal those soldiers felt when they saw those photographs? When they realized someone from their own country, someone famous, someone influential, was helping the people who were torturing them? The cameras kept switching between their faces, capturing every flicker of emotion, every breath, every fracture in the facade. Jane looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. Tom looked like he was only just getting started. But here's what really gets me, he continued, voice rising again like a wave gathering force. After all of that, after the damage, after the pain, after the propaganda victories you handed the enemy, you have the audacity, the absolute breathtaking audacity, to sit here today and attack my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. He paused, letting it land like a weight dropped onto the studio floor. You came here ready, Tom said, prepared talking points, planned attacks. You wanted to make me look bad on national television, to score cheap wins with your political base. The silence that followed settled over the room like a heavy blanket. You want to talk about being controlled, he added, voice lowering, sharpening. You've been controlled by your own ego, your desperate need to remain relevant for so long that you've lost touch with basic human decency. Joy Behar finally found the courage to speak. Tom, I think you're being a little harsh, she said softly, though she didn't sound convinced. Tom turned toward her slowly, and Joy instinctively leaned back. Joy, if someone in your family had been captured in Vietnam, tortured for months, and somehow came home alive, would you tell them they were being too harsh for being angry about Jane's little publicity stunt? Joy opened her mouth, searching for an answer that wasn't there. She closed it again. Tom looked back at Jane. You know what the real tragedy is? He asked. You could have been a force for good. You had influence, power, reach, more than most people ever will. You could have used it to actually help people. He shook his head, disappointment etched into his expression. Instead, you became a symbol of everything wrong with celebrity activism. You chose attention over integrity. You chose spectacle over service. Jane finally mustered a response, though her voice trembled but determined. That's not fair. I've spent my life fighting for important causes, women's rights, the environment, social justice. Fighting? Tom repeated, with a laugh that wasn't remotely amused. Jane, showing up at rallies and giving speeches isn't fighting. You want to know what fighting looks like? He pointed a finger downward, as if indicating something far heavier than the hardwood floor beneath them. Fighting is what American soldiers were doing while you posed for pictures with the people shooting at them. Fighting is what their families did, waiting, hoping, praying, while you handed the enemy another propaganda win. He leaned closer. What you do is performance art. The audience was silent, transfixed. The air felt electrically charged, like the moments before a storm breaks. Jane tried another angle, desperate to regain control. At least I've evolved, she said, voice cracking but determined. I've grown. I've learned. Can you say the same about your organization? Are you really going to claim there haven't been mistakes? It was a gamble, a last attempt to redirect the attack back onto him. Tom didn't flinch. You want to talk about evolution? He said, eyes blazing. Real evolution is taking responsibility without excuses. Real evolution is admitting you were wrong, without spin, without justification, without rewriting the past. His voice rose again, not louder, but deeper, heavier, carrying more weight than before. What you've done isn't evolution, it's image rehabilitation. You've spent decades trying to sand down the edges of your mistakes, rewriting history so you can play the wise elder stateswoman. But wisdom doesn't come from spin. It comes from understanding the real cost of your failures and carrying that weight with humility. Jane's eyes now glistened. You don't know what it was like, she whispered. You don't know the pressure, the confusion. Confusion? Let me clear up the confusion. When your country is at war and your countrymen are dying, you don't fly to the enemy capital and pose for propaganda photos. That isn't complicated. That isn't confusing. He paused, voice dropping to a quiet, devastating register. That's basic human decency. That's loyalty. That's common sense. He sat back slightly, the studio still frozen in place, every eye locked on him as he gathered himself for whatever came next.
The entire studio seemed to lean forward, as if gravity itself had shifted toward Tom. Every camera operator, every crew member, every audience member held their breath, waiting for what would come next. You know what really bothers me about this conversation, Jane? Tom said, his voice low but edged with unmistakable steel. It's not just what you did 50 years ago. It's how you handled it ever since. Jane's eyes widened, but Tom pressed on. You've built an entire narrative around yourself. Poor Jane, she was young, idealistic. Poor Jane, she was manipulated by the anti-war movement. Poor Jane, everyone misunderstood her noble intentions. His tone grew sharper, slicing through the room like a cold wind. You've made a career out of being the victim. Jane's face drained of color. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "That's not—" But Tom didn't let her finish. "Here's the truth you've never had the courage to face," he said, his voice rising just enough to fill the studio. "You weren't a victim in Vietnam, Jane. Those prisoners were victims. Those families waiting at home were victims. Those soldiers who returned to find out that a Hollywood actress had handed their captors a propaganda victory, they were victims." He leaned back slightly, never breaking eye contact. "You were someone who made a choice, a reckless, selfish choice, and you've spent 50 years trying to dodge the consequences." The silence that filled the studio was suffocating. Camera operators stood frozen, terrified that any movement might disrupt the electricity of the moment. Sound engineers hovered over their controls, afraid to miss even a breath. Everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be dissected, replayed, and remembered for years. "And now," Tom continued, his voice building again like a wave preparing to crash, "you want to sit here and lecture me about questionable choices. You want to question my integrity, my beliefs?" He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "Jane, the time you've spent trying to rehabilitate your image could have been spent actually reflecting on the people you hurt." He pointed toward her, not aggressively, but with the gravity of someone delivering a verdict. "You've become a professional victim. You've played the role so long, you've convinced yourself it's true. And somehow, in your mind, that gives you the moral authority to judge other people." Jane's voice cracked as she tried to salvage something from the wreckage. I was trying to end a war that was killing people. I was trying to highlight something that was fundamentally wrong." "No," Tom said firmly. "You were trying to get attention."
The words hit her like a physical blow. You could have protested at home, worked with Congress, used your fame to raise awareness, but you didn't choose any of those options. You chose the one that put you on the front page. Because that's what you really wanted, to be the star of your own political drama, no matter who got hurt. Jane's tears spilled freely now, streaking her makeup. She looked utterly shattered, unable to speak, unable even to breathe steadily. "You want to know the difference between your choices and mine?" Tom asked. His voice wasn't angry now. It was disappointed. "My choices are about trying to help people, trying to make things better. Yours, in Vietnam, were about inserting yourself into someone else's tragedy. And that's exactly what you're doing today." Whoopi made a desperate attempt to regain control. "Maybe we should all take a breath." But Tom was already moving into the final, devastating arc of his monologue. "You came here ready to attack my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. But the moment someone shines the light back on you, your entire righteous crusade collapses." He paused, letting the words sink into the hushed room. "That tells me everything I need to know. It's easy to throw stones when you think you're standing on moral high ground. It's harder when someone reminds you your own house is made of glass." Jane stared downward, shoulders trembling, completely undone. "And here's the saddest part," Tom said, his voice softening but still unyielding. "You could have used this moment to show humility, to take responsibility, to actually help someone." He shook his head slowly. "But instead you tried to tear someone else down to make yourself feel better about your own failures." Jane didn't respond. She couldn't. The studio didn't breathe.
"And that," Tom said quietly, "is just sad." The camera cut to Jane's face, and in that instant, the entire world saw the moment something inside her broke. The fire was gone. The fight was gone. She looked like someone realizing, perhaps for the very first time, that all her carefully rehearsed explanations, all her decades of reputation repair, all her polished justifications had shattered in a few brutal minutes on live television. "That's what people like you never understand," Tom continued, his voice layered with disappointment and unmistakable pity. "Real strength isn't about attacking others to make yourself look good. Real courage isn't about tearing people down so you can stand taller. Real integrity is admitting your mistakes and doing better. It's not about spending half a century pointing fingers at everyone but yourself." Joe Bayar made a weak attempt to intervene. "Jane has done a lot of good work over the years," she said softly, though even she didn't sound convinced. Tom turned to her slowly, his gaze sharp and unblinking. "Has she?" he asked. The question hit with surprising force. "Or has she just done work that looks good? There's a huge difference, Joy. There's a world of difference between helping people and looking like you help people for the sake of a camera." He turned back to Jane. She was staring down at her hands, tears dripping silently onto her dress like tiny beads of regret. "Jane," Tom said, his tone softening, but his words no less sharp, "I want you to think about something. When you go home tonight, when the lights are off and you're alone with your thoughts, I want you to ask yourself one honest question." He waited. The silence was suffocating. "In all these interviews, in all your statements, in all the apologies crafted by your PR team, have you ever, even once, truly thought about those prisoners and their families as real people, real human beings, or were they just obstacles in the path of repairing your image?" The blow landed instantly. Jane physically recoiled, her shoulders folding inward as if to shield herself from it. For a moment, it looked as though she might collapse entirely, break down completely, and dissolve into sobs right there under the unforgiving studio lights. But Tom didn't pause. "Because that's what this is really about," he said, voice low but relentless. "Not politics, not organizations, not whether the war was right or wrong. This is about empathy. This is about realizing your actions had consequences for real people. Not just for your career, your legacy, or how history books talk about you, but for actual human beings who suffered because of the choices you made." He leaned back, signaling the end of his indictment. "So before you question anyone else's integrity, maybe you should take a long, hard look at your own. Maybe ask yourself whether you're actually trying to help people or just trying to make yourself feel better about the damage you've done." The silence that followed felt eternal. Jane sat frozen, completely undone, unable to speak. Tears fell onto her hands unchecked. The other hosts exchanged helpless, horrified looks. No one knew how to end this. How could they? At last, after what felt like a lifetime, Whoopi cleared her throat and looked into the camera. "Well, this has certainly been an interesting conversation. Tom, thank you for being here." But Tom had one final message. He turned toward the camera, the audience at home, and spoke with quiet, devastating clarity. "People can attack my beliefs, my choices, my lifestyle. That's fine. But I can sleep at night knowing I've never betrayed my country. I've never given comfort to people who tortured American prisoners, and I've never spent decades making excuses for inexcusable behavior." He let that settle like dust after an explosion. And I think that's a good place to start any conversation about character. With perfect composure, Tom rose, shook Whoopi's hand, nodded to the other hosts, and walked off stage, leaving behind what would instantly become one of the most uncomfortable, most unforgettable moments in daytime television history. Jane remained seated for several seconds, still staring at her trembling hands. When she finally looked up, the expression on her face was unmistakable. Total defeat. The woman who had come in ready for battle had been utterly dismantled. The cameras cut to commercial, but the damage was already permanent. Social media would explode, news networks would replay the clip endlessly, and one question would dominate the conversation for days. Did Tom Cruise go too far? Or did he simply say what millions had been thinking for decades? Whatever the truth, one thing was undeniable. No one who saw that moment would ever forget it.